Before Rome bled, before temples burned, before the gods themselves were humiliated, there was a boy, and that boy would become something Rome had never seen: an emperor in silk, a priest in blood, a bride of the sun, and a living curse on an empire. His name was Varius Avitus Bassianus. But history remembers him as Elagabalus. He would be crowned at 14. He would marry men in public and declare himself a woman. He would demand doctors turn him into one. He would drown the Palatine in blood rituals, forcing senators to watch as boys screamed and animals bled on golden altars. He would build a temple to a black meteorite and make Rome bow to it. He would die naked with his guards, release lions into banquet halls, and turn the palace into a shrine of pleasure and pain. He would wear wedding veils and serve strangers in brothels. He would kiss death on the lips and laugh while empires trembled. But before all that, he was just a boy in a room with no windows. The city was a mesa, Roman Syria. Inside a smoky, airless chamber stood a stone. Black, smooth, terrifying. A meteorite, they said. A god, they believed. Elagabalus. No face, no limbs. Just weight, presence, voice. And beside it, the boy. He was 8, dressed in shimmering gold that hung from his tiny frame. Kohl around his eyes, rings on his fingers, bells on his ankles. When he walked, he didn't speak. He jingled. The priest taught him to dance in blood, to chant words that had no meaning except to the stone. His first ritual, he watched a goat's throat sliced open and its warm blood poured onto the floor. By the third, he was barefoot in it, spinning, chanting, laughing. People swore the god answered, that the stone vibrated, that lightning struck the sky when the boy danced. He barely spoke outside the temple. Some said he had no voice of his own, that when he did speak, it wasn't the boy, it was the god. In the market, they whispered that he never slept, that animals obeyed him, that children cried when they looked at him too long. His mother, Julia Soemius, smiled at the worship. But it was his grandmother, Julia Maesa, who saw something darker. Not holiness, not magic, power. When Caracalla was murdered and Rome groaned for an heir, Maesa did not pray. She plotted, "Let the empire rot," she said. "I will put a god on the throne." She turned to the boy, knelt before the stone and whispered, "You will rule them all. They will bow to your lips and crawl before your god." He looked up slowly, eyes wide, face blank. "I want to be the sun," he said. She smiled. "Then burn them." This is not just the story of an emperor. It's the story of a curse wrapped in silk, a god draped in blood, a child born in shadows who lit the world on fire. This is the story of Elagabalus. It stood atop the Palatine hill, glistening with foreign gold and the scent of eastern incense. The Elagabalium, the temple of Elagabalus's god, was unlike anything Rome had ever seen. Where other temples offered solemn altars and quiet reverence, this one throbbed with drums, perfumes, flesh, and spectacle. At its heart stood the black stone from Emesa, the sacred meteorite said to have fallen from the heavens. Elagabalus treated it not as symbol, but as God incarnate. He placed it above all others, above Jupiter, Mars, Apollo. The emperor demanded all Romans accept its supremacy. To the priests of Jupiter, this was sacrilege. To the Senate, this was war on tradition. But no one dared defy the boy emperor. He summoned the Vestal virgins and had them participate in ceremonies they were forbidden to even witness. He paraded the meteorite through the streets in a chariot of gold, escorted by dancing eunuchs and drummers from Syria, scattering rose petals as they passed. Citizens were forced to kneel. He declared the Roman god subservient to his stone. One by one, statues of old deities were removed from shrines and brought to the Elagabalium. There, Elagabalus proclaimed they were to marry his god. He staged weddings between the meteorite and these statues, complete with lavish feasts, dances, and sacrifices. He wore the robes of a high priestess and danced ecstatically in front of the altar, his body painted, his voice shrieking ancient chants. The ceremonies were long, feverish, and often bloody. He sacrificed bulls, goats, even rare birds. Blood stained the marble floors. Musicians played relentlessly. It was said that during one ceremony, a child's cries were heard among the offerings, but no one dared speak of it afterward. And then came the feasts. Nobles were invited, or compelled, to attend banquets in the temple complex. The food was rich, the wine endless. But guests never knew what they might see. Elagabalus would appear nude, oiled, wearing only golden jewellery, reclining on silken couches among his lovers, male, female, and those in between. He would sometimes disappear behind a curtain and return in different attire, dressed as a goddess, a bride, or in soldier's armour lined with pearls. He spoke of uniting all religions under his own. He laughed at Roman customs. He claimed the East was the soul of the world and that Rome must bow. The Praetorian Guard, assigned to protect him, watched in silence. Many began to look away. But the emperor noticed. He replaced seasoned guards with foreign dancers. He called them his sacred watchmen, men with painted faces and perfumed skin. They carried no swords, only golden rods. One senator whispered, "He has made the gods into whores and Rome into a brothel." The next morning that senator's tongue was nailed to the Senate door. Rome had fallen under a new sun, one that did not warm, one that burned. He did not just worship a god, he wanted to become one. Elagabalus no longer saw himself as merely a ruler. He began to speak of divinity in the mirror, of fusion with his god, of transformation. The emperor, now no older than 16, declared that gender was a Roman fiction, that the sun did not see man or woman, only essence. He started appearing in public dressed as a bride. At first it was whispered that he had married a man, a charioteer named Heracles. Then the whispers became proclamations. Elagabalus declared himself Heracles' wife. He kissed him openly in the forum. He called him husband at banquets and demanded senators toast to their union. It was not his only marriage. He wed multiple men in succession, each ceremony more lavish than the last. He ordered musicians to play foreign wedding songs. He wore veils and wedding crowns. He insisted on being referred to as lady, even during Senate business. But one wedding shook the empire to its core. He married a Vestal virgin. Her name was Aquilia Severa, and by Roman law, Vestals were sworn to chastity for 30 years. Violating that oath was punishable by live burial. But Elagabalus declared her the perfect match for his god, a union of fire and sun. He dragged her from her sacred house and paraded her through the streets in bridal white, flanked by eunuchs and foreign priests. The crowd watched in silence. Some wept, others screamed, but none could stop it. They married beneath the shadow of the Palatine. In the temple of the meteorite, blood was spilled in offering. Incense clouded the air. He lifted her hand, crowned her empress, and declared that Rome's old laws were dead. The priesthood was furious. The Senate was appalled. But Elagabalus laughed. "Why should I follow the laws of dead men?" he asked during one drunken feast. "Am I not a god myself?" He began referring to himself as both emperor and empress. He demanded courtiers address him with female titles. He started searching for surgeons who could alter his body, offering enormous sums to anyone who could perform the impossible. According to Cassius Dio, Elagabalus asked to be given female genitalia. Not just in dress or behaviour, but in flesh. It was more than a scandal. It was sacrilege, heresy, madness, depending on who you asked. In the palace, he built a chamber of mirrors. He would dress himself in silks, cover himself in perfumes, and rehearse ceremonies in front of his own reflection. He prayed not as emperor, but as priestess. He anointed his own body with oils meant for statues. The people no longer knew whether to fear him or pity him, but the powerful had begun to plot. In Rome's underbelly, the whispers had changed, not of outrage, but of knives. There were nights in Rome when the stars seemed to vanish, not from the sky, but from memory. Nights when time collapsed under silk, incense, and the scent of meat left too long in wine. These were the nights of Elagabalus's banquets, lavish, obscene, and legendary. He didn't eat to nourish himself. He fed to dazzle, to dominate, to destroy expectations. His feast began at sunset and ended with sunrise. Hundreds of guests were summoned to the palace or the temple complex, many against their will. Senators, foreign dignitaries, musicians, gladiators, slaves, priests. No one was too sacred or too low. The emperor reclined at the centre, oiled and adorned, draped in golden veils, his fingers crusted with rings. Behind him stood eunuchs fanning perfumed air, and around him, his lovers, male and female alike, reclining on cushions stuffed with ostrich feathers and rose petals. The food was spectacle. He served flamingo tongues, camel heels, peacock brains. Dishes were shaped to mimic Roman gods, or organs, or grotesque mythic beasts. Wine was mixed with crushed pearls or flakes of gold. Guests never received the same meal twice. One senator wrote that he was fed a course of air, glass dishes covered in flower petals and scented steam. But the cruelty came in layers. Sometimes the ceiling would open and rain down gifts. Coins, perfumes, fruits. Other times it rained rose petals. So many petals, in fact, that guests were buried alive beneath them. Cassius Dio claims some suffocated this way, smiling for fear of offending the emperor. At one feast, Elagabalus released wild animals into the banquet hall, lions, leopards, and bears. They had been trained not to kill, but to roam. The guests froze in terror as the creatures prowled between couches, licking spilt wine and sniffing trembling dignitaries. In another, he released birds into the dining room. Hundreds of them. They landed on heads, in bowls, on tables. The noise was unbearable, the food impossible to eat. Sometimes he would seat his guests according to their beauty. The most handsome were placed closest to him. He would grope them, kiss them, offer them jewellery, and sometimes lead them away during the meal. He enjoyed watching people squirm. Once he served fake food to the highborn: wax fruit, wooden meat, painted bread. Meanwhile, slaves feasted on delicacies nearby. Another time, he reversed roles entirely. Nobles dressed as beggars, beggars dressed as kings. Every gathering was a stage for humiliation. But not all was cruelty. Some came willingly. For the gifts, the favours, the madness. They laughed as Rome trembled. And all the while, Elagabalus watched. At the climax of each banquet, he often gave a speech. Not as emperor, but as priest. He would rise, arms outstretched, eyes rolling back, and shout praise to Elagabal. He swore Rome was reborn in pleasure, that discipline was disease, and that old gods died with old laws. Who needs a senate when we can feast forever? He once proclaimed, drunk on pearl wine. Some guests clapped, others wept. A few never left the room. The altar floor was never dry. Within the temple of Elagabal, blood became ritual. Every morning priests swept away what remained of the night before: animal guts, feathers, bones, clotted pools of crimson. But the stains never truly left. They soaked into the marble, into the hands of the slaves, into the breath of the city itself. Elagabalus believed sacrifice was the breath of the divine. But he didn't offer solemn tributes. His rites were theatre. Violent, ecstatic, obscene. He slaughtered bulls with jewelled daggers, their hot blood spraying across his silk robes. He tore open the bellies of goats and read omens in their steaming entrails. Peacocks were strangled with golden cords. Ostriches beheaded in rhythm to chanting. And always he danced, arms painted in red ochre, face streaked with ash, his voice shrieking foreign words as incense burned thick around him. The emperor built a stage above the altar, where he performed these ceremonies before crowds of invited nobles, trembling petitioners, and hand-picked lovers. Some were forced to attend. Others came willingly, for favours, for titles, for access to the unpredictable centre of power. The temple echoed with screams, not always animal. Whispers told of human sacrifice. Cassius Dio wrote cautiously, never daring to confirm, but suggesting that slaves disappeared, that criminals were sent not to executioners, but to the Elagabalium. One account claimed that Elagabalus offered a living boy to the sun god during the summer solstice, covering the child's mouth with roses and slitting his throat as drums thundered. There were no records of a burial. Elagabalus did not separate flesh from faith. He demanded his lovers bleed for him, sometimes literally. He pierced them during rituals, anointing their wounds with wine. He painted his own body in goat blood before sex, claiming it made him more divine. He called it union. Others called it madness. Once he summoned a group of senators to witness a divine marriage. They arrived to find statues of Roman gods placed in a circle, surrounded by torches. In the centre, a cow, painted gold and drugged into stillness. Elagabalus approached, naked but for a crown, and performed a rite so obscene it was never described in detail. When it ended, he fell to the ground, sobbing in ecstasy, shouting, "The god is pleased." He smeared his face with ashes and blood and kissed the feet of the meteorite. And all the while, Rome watched and whispered. His mother, Julia Soamius encouraged him. She attended the rites dressed as a priestess, calling herself the Mother of God. His grandmother Julia Maisa grew silent. The city was not only scandalized, it was exhausted. The guard grew restless. The Senate withdrew into silence. And yet the emperor grew bolder. He began replacing traditional holidays with festivals of his own invention, parades of eunuchs, fire dancers, naked priests in painted masks. The Saturnalia, once a day of revelry, became a week-long frenzy of sex, ritual, and inversion. Citizens were forced to attend. Those who refused were dragged through the streets. "Rome has forgotten how to weep," one elder senator reportedly said. "Now we only choke on laughter and blood." But the boy in the golden robes didn't care. He had turned faith into a weapon. And Rome, it seemed, had no god strong enough to stop him. There was no more distinction between palace and brothel. Elagabalus had erased the line entirely. By the year 220 AD, the imperial residence had become a theatre of flesh. The marble halls once walked by Augustus, and Hadrian now echoed with laughter, moans and drunken singing. The emperor turned private quarters into salons of vice, where he played not the role of host but of spectacle. He ordered rooms redesigned as bedrooms, each with a different theme: Egyptian, Syrian, Dionysian. In one, walls were lined with mirrors so that every movement reflected endlessly. In another, cushions and silks covered the floors, and the air hung thick with perfumes, aphrodisiacs and incense. Elagabalus would lie naked behind a golden curtain, waiting. Courtiers, soldiers, senators, even slaves were summoned one by one. He offered gold for their affection, jewels for submission, titles for humiliation. He didn't hide it. He revelled in it. He bragged that he had more lovers than any woman in Rome. According to Cassius Dio, the emperor frequently dressed as a prostitute and worked from a room in the palace like a common brothel. He stood behind a door, nude, asking passers-by if they wanted pleasure. He ordered guards to spread word of his services so strangers would come. He paid them afterward. Sometimes he took the passive role. Other times he demanded control, and always he called it worship. "I am the priestess of the sun," he said, "and my body is the altar." But it wasn't just sex, it was power. Those who rejected him were punished. One tribune who refused to lie with the emperor was reassigned to a plague-stricken outpost in Africa. Another, a senator, was stripped of rank and found dead a week later. The cause was never confirmed. Elagabalus made a mockery of Roman masculinity. He mocked generals for their beards, priests for their chastity, and nobles for their traditions. He forced one nobleman to wear a woman's dress and dance before the court. Another was made to crawl on all fours and bark like a dog for entertainment. The emperor's inner circle became a twisted court of jesters, prostitutes, and actors. He elevated charioteers to high office, appointed dancers as military advisors, and gave priests control over finances. Experience meant nothing. Obedience and pleasure were everything. One man, Zoticus of Smyrna, was brought to Rome purely for his beauty. Elagabalus made him his husband, gave him a palace, and declared him master of the imperial bed. Zoticus wore only translucent silks and was paraded through the forum on a golden litter. But when Elagabalus tired of him, he vanished. This pattern repeated. Lover after lover, used and discarded, rewarded, then ruined. Each new obsession more public, more grotesque. He even claimed once to have married the moon and held a symbolic wedding in the middle of the night, dressed in silver, howling prayers to the sky. Meanwhile, Rome burned, not with flames but with resentment. The Praetorian Guard watched in silence. The Senate pretended to rule. And the people, once curious, now muttered prayers to old gods they no longer trusted. The empire felt drunk, dizzy, off balance, and the boy at its centre danced beneath a golden veil laughing. Rome had seen madness before. Caligula, Nero, Commodus. But under Elagabalus, insanity became institution. It wasn't a passing phase, it was the state religion. The emperor no longer ruled by law, but by performance, and the entire city had become his audience. He announced a new holiday, the Carnival of the Invincible Sun. It would last 10 days, then be extended to a month, then again. By the end of the year, it had no end. The city's streets filled with masked dancers, eunuchs painted in gold, and musicians playing foreign instruments. Romans who refused to participate were dragged into the crowds, stripped and painted. It was said even the statues of Jupiter and Mars were forced to wear veils and perfume. The emperor himself paraded through the streets in a chariot drawn by naked women dressed in the robes of a Syrian goddess. He scattered coins and commanded the people to cheer, not for Rome, but for the sun god. Some did, others trembled. He held games in the Colosseum, but replaced gladiators with orgies of sacred theatre. Priests mimicked the gods copulating. Animals were made to fight naked slaves dressed as emperors. Once he released doves soaked in perfume and declared it a military triumph. At night the palace erupted into new extremes. He ordered mirrors placed across the forum so that his image would reflect endlessly. Fires were lit from temple to temple in honour of the night sun. And then came the trials. Citizens were arrested at random and accused of impiety. They were brought to the palace in chains and ordered to confess sins against the sun. Most had done nothing, but Elagabalus demanded performance. Some were forced to whip themselves in front of the court, others to crawl naked through halls of fire. The punishments were theatrical, not legal, penance by humiliation. He wept during these acts, declaring them purifying flames. He declared the Senate obsolete and replaced many of its seats with effigies of animals wearing togas. He spoke to them during sessions, asking their opinions, then laughing at their silence. Real senators watched from the back, silent. At the heart of the madness, Elagabalus began calling himself by a new name, Dea Caelestis, the celestial goddess. He no longer signed edicts as emperor but as priestess of the invincible sun. Official documents included prayers to himself. Foreign dignitaries fled, trade slowed, temples fell empty. The Forum, once the pulse of the Republic, echoed with laughter, not law. He once climbed the steps of the Capitoline Hill, naked except for chains, and declared, "I am Rome reborn. I am the god you feared." The people didn't cheer, they watched. Children were forbidden from approaching the palace. Mothers turned away when the emperor passed. Priests of old cults met in secret. And in the barracks, the praetorians sharpened their blades. The carnival never ended. It only changed masks. In a palace soaked with gold, blood, and perfume, the only thing more dangerous than Elagabalus's madness was the silence of Julia Maesa. His grandmother, the architect of his rise, had watched her creation spiral into chaos. She, who had bribed generals, forged bloodlines, and whispered lies that toppled an emperor, now stood in the shadows, eyes cold, lips sealed. At first she had believed she could control him. She'd imagined the boy priest as a puppet, a means to restore Severan rule. But Elagabalus was no puppet. He had torn the strings from her fingers and danced on the graves of her ambitions. The imperial court had become unrecognisable. The empress mother, Julia Soemius, now styled herself consort of the sun, walking barefoot through the halls in ritualistic trances. She bathed in rosewater and goat's milk, proclaimed visions from the gods, and praised her son's divine marriage to the meteorite. Julia Maesa watched, and she waited. She heard the whispers in the forum. Traitor, pervert, antichrist. She saw the guards' unease, their cold stares, their reluctance to kneel. She noted the Senate's absence, the city's stillness during the emperor's parades. Even the wind seemed to hush when Elagabalus passed. Then came the breaking point. One evening, during a banquet so obscene, it silenced even the most jaded guest, Elagabalus stood nude atop a table, painted in silver, and announced he would soon appoint his lover, a 17-year-old pantomime actor, as Caesar, heir to the throne. The room froze. The boy, barely literate, had once played a dancing satyr in the street. Now he would be second in command of the Roman Empire. That night, Julia Maesa summoned the commander of the Praetorian Guard. They spoke in hushed tones. Then she made a decision that would define history. She turned to her other grandson, Alexander, Sextus Varius Avitus Alexander, younger, quieter, Romanized. He was raised in the old traditions, trained in Greek and Latin, dressed like the old emperors. Where Elagabalus burned like fire, Alexander was ice, controlled, calculated. Maesa saw in him not just a grandson, but a weapon. She began grooming him in secret, introducing him to key senators, allowing whispers to spread that he was a possible successor. The Praetorians noticed. Some began visiting Alexander in private. They found him respectful, rational, obedient. They liked him. Elagabalus noticed the shift. He grew erratic. He accused his grandmother of treason. He locked Alexander in a palace room. He held orgies outside the door to torment him. He forced him to attend rituals where animals were disemboweled and their entrails smeared on the walls. Julia Maesa said nothing. But behind her silence, a machine was turning. She offered bribes, gold, land, favour. The guard, weary and humiliated, listened. And as the sun god's high priest danced alone in his hall of mirrors, Rome quietly chose another son. The Praetorian Guard had once sworn their loyalty, with swords drawn and heads bowed. Now they whispered in corners. They were Rome's elite, its shield, its blade. But under Elagabalus they had become jesters in golden armour, forced to parade in pink robes, dance at temple festivals, guard shrines instead of generals. Some were made to wear makeup, others were assigned to beautify the palace halls with flower garlands. Their pride was gone. Their anger grew. The turning point came not with an order, but with humiliation. Elagabalus forced the guard to stand watch during a week-long festival honouring his god's rebirth. They wore wreaths, smeared their faces with saffron, and were instructed to chant in Syrian. If they refused, they were whipped publicly. Veterans of Parthian wars now guarded a boy priest who called himself a goddess. Behind the barracks walls, a quiet storm built. Julia Maesa visited often, never openly. She brought wine, food, coin. But more than that, she brought reason. She whispered of tradition, of the old Rome of Alexander. "You are soldiers," she said once to a group of centurions. "You protect emperors, not dancers." They listened. The guard began to split. Some remained loyal to Elagabalus. Those favoured with riches, with carnal access to the palace, or with fear. But many drifted toward the boy Alexander. They saw in him a figure they could respect. He spoke softly, dressed plainly, saluted them. He gave them dignity. The emperor sensed the shift. His fury was immediate. He ordered arrests, tortures, executions. Soldiers vanished. A centurion found murdered in his sleep. Another publicly accused of treason, then beaten to death with rods. Elagabalus declared, "The sun sees all and punishes impurity." But blood did not cleanse loyalty. It buried it deeper. Then, in a final act of desperation, Elagabalus demanded Alexander be executed. He summoned the Praetorian prefect and gave the order. The prefect refused. A day later, the palace gates were locked. The emperor raged. He tore down statues of Mars, broke ceremonial swords, screamed blasphemies in the temple. He called the guard traitors, women, cowards. He declared martial law. The next morning, banners appeared across the Castra Praetoria. They bore one name, Alexander. The guard no longer belonged to Elagabalus. Julia Maesa made her move. She issued a decree claiming Elagabalus had fallen ill, and Alexander had been named heir to ensure stability. The people rejoiced. Senators returned to the forum. Markets opened. Prayers were offered. For Alexander, not Elagabalus. The emperor tried to flee. He fled the palace in disguise, dressed as a slave, hidden in a cart of laundry. But he was caught by his own guards at the city gate. They did not salute. They took him in silence. The high priest of the sun was about to face Rome's oldest god, vengeance. The storm broke at dawn, March 11th, 222 AD. A crimson morning bled over Rome's rooftops as the palace awoke to an eerie quiet. No processions, no chants, no music. The imperial courtyards, usually crawling with eunuchs, dancers and perfumed guards, were empty. The halls smelled only of extinguished incense. Elagabalus sensed the change. He rose from his bed, wrapped in golden silk, eyes lined with kohl, lips still red from the previous night's festivities. His mother, Julia Soaemius, stood at the window, staring toward the Castra Praetoria. "They are late," she said. There would be no arrival. The Praetorian Guard was already marching, with weapons drawn not for protection, but for purification. The order had been given. Elagabalus was to die. But it was not Julia Maesa who signed the order. It was the men themselves, centurions and tribunes, who had endured too much, seen too far, and bled too long in service of a boy priest who mocked their gods, their laws, their empire. They entered the palace in silence. No fanfare, no warnings. Elagabalus fled. He dragged his mother through the corridors, past marble gods smeared in goat blood and torn silk. They reached the servants' wing, then the stables. They tried to escape through a service gate, but the soldiers were already there, cornered in the latrina, the public toilets of the palace. Elagabalus begged. He offered gold, land, women, boys. He swore to leave Rome, to renounce his god, to disappear. But the guards had heard it all before. Some claimed he fell to his knees, crying, his makeup streaking like a painted statue in the rain. He died with a scream. They stabbed him first in the chest, then the stomach. His mother clung to him, shrieking curses and prayers, before a blade pierced her throat. Blood mixed on the stone floor beneath their bodies. The carnage did not end there. The corpses were dragged through the hall stripped naked. Soldiers tore down tapestries, shattered altars, smashed statues of the sun god. The great black meteorite, once paraded through the city on golden chariots, was sent back to Emesa. Elagabalus's body was thrown into the Tiber, but before that it was dragged through the streets. Mobs spat on it. Children threw stones. Dogs sniffed at the blood trails. Someone tied a dead cat to his ankle. Julia Soaemias fared no better. Her head was mounted on a spike outside the palace gates. Rome exhaled. Temples reopened. The Senate reconvened. The people returned to the streets with cautious steps. A new emperor had been named, Alexander Severus, young but respectable, silent where Elagabalus had shouted. The boy priest was gone, and yet even in death he lingered. Whispers of his rituals continued, the tales of his lovers, his surgeries, his gold-plated feasts. Some claimed his spirit haunted the palace, appearing in mirrors where he once watched himself dance. Others said the Tiber rejected his corpse, washing it ashore for days. The historians struggled. Some, like Cassius Dio, wrote of his cruelty with exhausted fury. Others, like Herodian, painted him as deluded, lost. But none could agree on what he truly was: monster, martyr, madman, or mirror to the empire itself. One thing remained certain: Rome had killed its god, but not its hunger for spectacle. The Tiber swallowed his body, but not his memory. In the days following the death of Elagabalus, Rome tried to erase him. Statues were torn down, paintings burned, coins bearing his face were melted, scraped, reminted. His name was scratched from inscriptions, his edicts repealed, his holidays abolished. Damnatio memoriae, the Roman sentence of memory damnation, was declared. It was as if he had never existed. But erasing a god is no easy task. Rumours spread faster than edicts. In taverns, in temples, in the whispered corners of bathhouses, his legend twisted and grew. Some claimed his palace orgies had summoned spirits. Others said his corpse still glowed at night along the Tiber's banks. One tale told of a sewer worker who saw his eyes open beneath the water. But beyond the ghost stories was something more enduring: fear. Rome feared what Elagabalus had revealed, that the line between God and man, ruler and ruin, was thinner than ever. He had torn open the old world and shown its guts: faith as theatre, sex as ritual, power as illusion. The Senate rushed to clean the mess. Alexander Severus, barely 14, was installed as emperor. He wore no makeup. He kissed no idols. His reign began with prayers to Jupiter and solemn oaths to restore tradition. The people were grateful. But they were watching. In private, nobles debated what had happened. Was it madness, possession, foreign corruption? Few admitted that Rome itself had made Elagabalus, that the same machine that forged emperors had birthed a boy who burned everything it gave him. Even his most outrageous acts had precedent. Had not Nero paraded through the streets in costume? Had not Caligula named his horse a senator? Elagabalus simply pulled the mask from Rome's face and laughed. And deep down, they remembered him. Whispers spoke of a secret cult that persisted in the eastern provinces, worshipping Elagabal not as a god, but as a martyr. Syrian soldiers lit fires at night and spoke his name. In Emesa, where the black meteorite had been returned, some claimed the rites continued. The empire moved on. Temples were scrubbed. New laws were passed. Streets were renamed. And yet beneath the marble his shadow stretched. Elagabalus became a cautionary tale, a bogeyman for emperors. Court poets referenced him only in mockery. Philosophers dissected his pathologies. Doctors speculated on his mind, his desires, his surgeries. One text claimed he sought to have female genitalia constructed, though no record confirmed it. In time, even the scorn faded. What remained was fascination. Centuries later, Christian chroniclers would point to him as proof of pagan degeneracy. Renaissance scholars whispered his name in treatises about decadence. Enlightenment thinkers dissected his rule as a psychological case study. And modern historians, unsure where fact ended and myth began, kept writing him back into the story. Because Rome could not forget, and perhaps deep down it did not want to. In Elagabalus it saw itself, glorious, depraved, beautiful, ungovernable. He was not the end of Rome, but its mirror, a distorted reflection of its desires, terrors, and truths. He ruled for 4 years. He has never really left. Elagabalus was dead, but the East did not forget. In the dusty hills of Syria, where the god Elagabal had once been worshipped long before Rome ever heard his name, there was no damnatio memoriae. There was only fire, incense, and silence. The black meteorite, the sacred symbol of the sun god, was returned to Emesa under guard. It arrived in secrecy, under cover of night, placed once more in the ancient temple, where the boy emperor had first served as priest. The city held no celebrations, but behind closed temple doors, the rituals resumed. Not for the empire, for the god. And perhaps for the boy who had once danced in his name. The cult of Elagabal never truly died. It was older than Rome, older than Jupiter, older than Latin itself. In Emesa, priests continued the rites Elagabalus had exported to the west. Animals were sacrificed. Ashes were poured into sacred urns. Drums pounded through the hills during solstice. And sometimes, rarely but not never, Elagabalus's name was spoken. Not as emperor, as martyr. The priest had lost a son, a sacred vessel, a bridge between the god and the empire that had shattered under its own weight. And among them, a story grew, that Elagabalus had been betrayed. They spoke of Roman decadence, not his but theirs, that Rome had lured him with promises of power, then mocked him when he did not pretend to be one of them, that they had dressed him in gold, fed him their poison, and destroyed him the moment he refused to bow to their gods. It was not entirely false. Many Syrian soldiers in the legions sympathized. He had been one of their own, a boy taken too young, too far from home, asked to play emperor in a world that despised where he came from, what he believed, how he lived. For all his cruelty, for all his spectacle, he had never pretended to be anything else. And so, the myth was born. In the outposts of the eastern frontier, in Palmyra, in Dura Europos, in Antioch, small rites took place. Coins bearing his image were kept hidden in walls. Tiny statuettes of the black stone were carved from basalt. A new title began to circulate, Servant of the Flame. These were not official cults. No temples bore his name. No senators wrote poems to his honour. But in the minds of those who had known only the whip of empire and the sneer of Rome, Elagabalus became something more than a mad emperor. He became defiance. The years passed. Alexander Severus ruled quietly. Syria remained restless. Trade routes reopened. Temples were restored. But the memory flickered beneath the surface. And then came Zenobia. Half a century after Elagabalus's death, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra would rise in rebellion. She would declare independence from Rome, march legions across the desert, and crown her son emperor. Some said she too had roots in Emesa. Some said she had been raised on the stories of the boy priest who died in a Roman latrine. It was never proven. But when her armies crossed the Euphrates, some carried amulets, black stones etched with suns, echoes not of policy or law or conquest, but of myth. Elagabalus did not live long enough to change Rome, but in the east he never truly left. After the blood dried in the latrines of the imperial palace, Rome began its purge. The new emperor, Alexander Severus, was just 14. But behind him stood Julia Maesa, now the most powerful woman in the empire, and a woman who had learned never to underestimate madness. She knew that Elagabalus had not risen alone. His reign had been propped up by priests, lovers, officials and opportunists who now scurried like rats in the sun. The purge began quietly. One by one, the boy priest's favourites disappeared. Zoticus, the lover once paraded as a god's consort, was found strangled in a bathhouse. Heracles, the charioteer whom Elagabalus had declared husband, vanished from the records. Some say he was sent to a quarry. Others say he was torn apart by dogs. No grave was marked. Temples to Elagabal were desecrated. The meteorite remained in a mesa, but any sign of its Roman chapter was extinguished. The lavish temple built in the capital was dismantled stone by stone. The foundation was buried. In its place, Alexander commissioned a public library, a symbol of reason where madness had once reigned. Julius Soaemius's remaining allies, those who had cheered at the golden chariot, who had thrown petals during the sun god's parades, were stripped of rank. Some were executed, others were exiled, their estates confiscated, their names erased. But the most insidious sweep was ideological. In schools, philosophers were instructed to discredit the reign of Elagabalus, not merely as immoral, but as un-Roman. Writers were paid to produce treatises on traditional Roman virtue. Poets who had once praised the divine youth now recited verses condemning his foreign madness. The emperor's wardrobe was burned. Thousands of gold-threaded robes, jewelled diadems, perfumed oils, all fed to the fire. A pyre was erected outside the city, not for bodies but for memories. Julia Maesa watched the flames. She did not cry. She had brought him to power. She had seen him fall. And now she buried him again, this time in silence. Alexander Severus, for all his youth, understood the assignment. He ruled with moderation. He restored the temples of Jupiter and Mars. He reappointed senators with long pedigrees. He walked through the forum in plain togas. When asked of his predecessor, he replied, "There is no such man." But the purge did not stop at Rome. In the provinces, governors were instructed to monitor temples, censor cults, and erase signs of Eastern influence. Eastern priests were expelled. Syrian art was removed from public spaces. Religious festivals were rebranded or banned. A cultural reversal. Rome wanted to be Roman again. And yet, the shadow remained. The more they erased, the more curious the people became. Smuggled paintings, scandalous stories, salacious poems about Elagabalus's reign found their way into taverns, bedrooms, and back alleys. Forbidden fruit. The Senate feared a revival. Whispers of surviving cultists surfaced. A shipment of small obsidian figurines was intercepted in Neapolis, each carved to resemble a boy with a sun behind his head. Julia Maesa ordered them ground to dust. She knew the truth. You could kill a man, you could erase his name, but you could never fully unmake a god. Long after his corpse had dissolved in the Tiber, the memory of Elagabalus remained. A phantom in the corridors of power, a name spoken with disdain, then fascination, then fear. In the years following his death, a strange transformation occurred. What had once been scandal became story, and what had been story became symbol. For Rome's new elite, Elagabalus was a cautionary tale. For the Senate, he was a reminder of their impotence. For generals, a warning of what happens when power lies in the wrong hands. But for the people, especially in the East, he became something else entirely. He became legend. Not of greatness, but of extremity. Stories circulated that grew with every telling. That he had once sewn pearls into his skin. That he had bathed in men's blood. That he held orgies in the forum disguised as a bride. That he tried to become a woman not out of mockery, but out of something deeper and unnamed. Each retelling added a layer. Some called him the first trans emperor. Others a divine lunatic, a martyr, a monster, a saint of sin. Even in Rome's academic circles, he lingered like perfume on silk. Historians debated his intentions. Philosophers questioned his nature. Physicians speculated about his body. Had he suffered a disorder? Had he been manipulated? Was he simply too much for Rome? The weight of his crown had not broken him. He had broken it. The Julian bloodline had carried gods and madmen. Augustus had brought peace. Nero had brought flames. Caligula, chaos. But none had danced so openly in blasphemy as Elagabalus. He mocked the rituals, inverted the norms, and crowned lust itself as divine. Rome was a city of masks. He had ripped his off. Julia Maesa spent her final years trying to erase what she had helped build. She ensured her daughter's name was forgotten. She poured funds into temples of Jupiter. She commissioned statues of Alexander as the ideal Roman youth, but nothing could fully obscure the shadow of the boy who once made senators dine under rose petals, while eunuchs sang hymns to the sun. Children in the Subura whispered that his ghost wandered the palace halls. A Praetorian guard once swore he saw golden sandals outside his quarters. Priests in Emesa began marking the day of his death with black ribbons. The crown that had sat on his head, adorned with sapphires set in gold, made for a sun god, was dismantled, the gems scattered, the gold melted. No emperor would wear it again. But the weight lingered. Every emperor after him ruled beneath the burden of memory, even the great ones. They looked over their shoulders when incense burned too sweet. They silenced poets who wrote too colourfully. They listened closely to any laughter that came from behind veils, because Elagabalus had shown that beneath Rome's marble skin there pulsed a hunger, for spectacle, for transgression, for ecstasy. And no crown, no matter how heavy, could silence that forever. By the middle of the 3rd century, Elagabalus had become less man, more myth. His name returned in strange places, in cautionary tales recited by tutors, in graffiti scratched on alley walls, in the mutterings of old soldiers. He was remembered, yes, but twisted, morphed, refracted through the lens of Rome's darkest curiosity. And yet he was not unique. Rome had seen madmen before, emperors who killed their kin, defiled temples, mocked gods. But none had so fully weaponized self-indulgence. None had lived so brazenly outside the norms of gender, faith and empire. His mirror began to appear centuries later, in writings not Roman but Christian. Church fathers, seeking to frame the corruption of paganism, held Elagabalus as the pinnacle of sin. They exaggerated what was already outrageous. He was no longer merely decadent, he was satanic, a blight sent by the gods to destroy Rome's soul. And so, he lived on. In medieval chronicles, his name surfaced beside that of Caligula and Nero. But while those emperors were remembered for their violence or cruelty, Elagabalus was remembered for something even more terrifying to the medieval mind: transgression. He had changed the rules. He had dared to remake the imperial self. One monastic text described him as a beast in pearls, another as the bride of demons. Artists refused to depict him, lest their work be cursed. His story became a whispered warning: if you stray too far from divine order, you invite ruin. But the Renaissance remembered differently. In the 15th century, scholars rediscovered Herodian and Cassius Dio. Their surviving manuscripts, fragile and half-burned, were pored over by men in velvet robes and golden rings. They saw in Elagabalus a symbol, not of evil, but of extremes. A subject for art, for allegory, for fascination. One painting showed him reclining on a couch of roses, wine flowing from his hands, surrounded by androgynous figures playing lyres. Another etched him with a crown of thorns, suggesting not mockery, but martyrdom. What had once disgusted now intrigued. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as Europe reeled from revolutions and monarchies fell, Elagabalus became a trope in literature. Writers invoked him when describing the excess of kings, the fall of empires, or the wild hunger of the human soul. He stood for everything the Enlightenment feared and secretly admired. Oscar Wilde, in private letters, mentioned him as a golden flame snuffed out by shadows. French poets described his palace as Rome's last masquerade. By the 20th century, psychology claimed him. Sigmund Freud's circle referenced Elagabalus in studies on identity and narcissism. Later, queer theorists debated him. Was he transgender, non-binary, something beyond Roman definitions? Modern historians argued endlessly. They debated whether ancient sources had lied, exaggerated, or told the brutal truth. Still, no one could look away. Elagabalus had become not a figure of Rome, but a mirror of ourselves. In every era we saw something different in him: the horror of blasphemy, the thrill of rebellion, the beauty of absolute freedom. He did not lead armies, he did not write laws, and yet his name endures longer than emperors who ruled wisely and died old. He reminds us that empires fear what they cannot control, and what they fear most is a man who refuses to be only that. There is one tale that survived all purges, all censorship, all damnations. It comes from Cassius Dio, later echoed by the historian Lampridius. Whether it happened exactly as written, no one can say. But the scene has been etched into the spine of Elagabalus's legend, a moment so decadent, so cruel, that it has become symbolic of everything he represented, the Feast of the Roses. According to the chroniclers, the emperor invited his closest courtiers, senators, dancers, priests and favourites to a private banquet. The palace's largest hall was draped in silks the colour of dusk, incense curled in thick ribbons, musicians played soft Eastern melodies, the air was heavy with myrrh, wine and anticipation. As the guests dined, sumptuous meats, exotic fruits, rare spices, slaves poured wine without end. The emperor, dressed as a goddess, lounged on a raised couch, feeding his lovers by hand. Then, at a signal, the ceiling opened. From hidden compartments in the rafters, petals began to fall. Not gently, not symbolically, but in a deluge. Roses, thousands upon thousands, fell like a perfumed avalanche. Their weight suffocated candles. They filled goblets. They covered tables, floors, laps, mouths. Some guests laughed. Others screamed. A few, trapped beneath the growing sea of petals, died, suffocated by luxury. Whether the tale is true or embellished, it became a metaphor. The Feast of the Roses came to symbolize a regime that devoured itself in beauty and madness, that choked on its own desire. Historians argued, was it murder or theatre, accident or intention? But no one denied the message it carried. Rome had forgotten hunger. In Elagabalus's Rome, sensation was the only currency. A simple feast was not enough. It had to be a performance, a sacrament to excess. And if lives were lost, they were offered not to gods but to experience. The tale struck a nerve. Poets invoked it in warnings. Let no man dine too richly, lest the roses fall. In the 1700s, a French dramatist turned it into an opera. In the 1800s, British painters recreated the scene with horrifying detail, faces contorted beneath petals, limbs vanishing into a soft red flood. In modern film, it remains a reference, the beauty that kills, the banquet that becomes a tomb. And for all Rome's attempts to bury Elagabalus, the rose feast ensured he would bloom forever. Because even his cruelty was exquisite. It forced a question few dared to ask: can beauty be evil? Can art kill? Can the most divine moment, flowers falling from the heavens, become the most terrible? For Elagabalus, the answer was yes. To him, life was a stage, and death, if it came adorned in roses, was merely the final act. Among the many rites imported from the East, none horrified Roman sensibilities more than the torchlight. This ancient ritual, common in the cults of Cybele and Mithras, was a blood baptism. But under Elagabalus, it was reimagined as theatre, as performance, as spectacle. The emperor did not simply perform the rite, he transformed it. According to Herodian and other later sources, Elagabalus commissioned a specially constructed temple chamber, open to the sky but with a wooden lattice platform suspended above a pit. In the pit stood a great altar. There bulls were led, massive beasts, their horns gilded, their hides anointed with perfumed oil, and above them the emperor. Naked, his body painted in golden dust, eyes lined with kohl, lips stained crimson, a crown of sun rays rested on his head. He stood barefoot, trembling in ecstasy, arms raised to the heavens. When the blade fell, and the bull's throat opened, the blood shot upward, gushing through the lattice, drenching him. He did not flinch. He welcomed it. To the priests of Elagabal, it was sacred union. Man and God merged in crimson baptism. To Romans raised on stoic virtue and civic piety, it was abhorrent, barbaric, deranged. Whispers spread quickly, that he drank the blood, that he danced in it, that he bathed in the entrails. None could be confirmed. But the image stuck. The emperor's high priest of horror, a ruler soaked not in Roman virtue, but in blood and blasphemy. The torchlight became his emblem, and he did not limit it to bulls. Rumours, unverified but persistent, spoke of other victims, exotic animals, birds. Even some whispered condemned prisoners dressed in golden masks. These stories likely came from enemies, but in the fog of outrage, fiction felt real. And Elagabalus made no effort to correct them. He fed on the reaction. He wanted Rome to look, to shudder, to remember. Each ritual drew more attention. The Senate sent envoys to protest. Philosophers wrote condemnations. One wrote, "The gods do not speak in blood, only beasts do." But still the rituals continued, each time more elaborate, each time more theatrical, a spectacle not of cruelty alone, but of transformation, of identity unbound by law, tradition, or body. Elagabalus seemed determined to become something more than man, something divine, something terrible, something eternal. And in doing so, he crossed every line, because while Rome tolerated madness in whispers, it could not endure madness on a throne. Not when it stained marble floors red, not when it dared call itself sacred. The blood rites would become part of the indictment against him, even after death. Historians used them to prove his depravity. Artists reimagined them in morbid detail. Golden boys bathing in gore, altars soaked in sunlight and entrails. Even today they linger in the imagination. Not because of what they were, but because of what they said. That for Elagabalus, there were no gods above him, only mirrors. To rule Rome was one thing, to rewrite its soul, another entirely. Among Elagabalus's most shocking acts, none enraged the Roman elite more than his creation of the imperial eunuch choir. In Eastern cults, eunuchs often held sacred positions. They were seen as neither male nor female, liminal beings fit to serve gods that defied earthly categories. In the temples of Cybele, Attis, and Elagabal, they danced, bled, and prophesied. But to the Roman aristocracy, the practice was alien, perverse, a stain on the masculine, militaristic ideal of Romanitas. Elagabalus did not care. He ordered the recruitment, some said abduction, of young boys from across the empire, beautiful, effeminate, and unblemished. They were brought to the palace clothed in silks, perfumed with oils, adorned with jewellery. Then they were castrated, not in secrecy, in ceremony. The emperor declared it an offering to the sun, that to serve the divine, one must transcend the flesh. The rite was held in the temple, before an altar, as music played and incense choked the air. The choir that emerged became infamous. They sang in high, haunting voices that echoed through the palace halls at night. Some compared the sound to angels, others to spirits. Each wore a diadem. Each had a name given by Elagabalus, some masculine, some feminine, many neither. He adored them. They accompanied him everywhere, to baths, to banquets, to temples. He kissed them in public. He wept when they were ill. When one died of fever, he declared a state of mourning. The Senate was horrified. Word spread fast. Pamphlets appeared in the markets, drawings of the eunuch choir surrounded by snakes, demons, and strange beasts. Conservative orators decried the rape of youth under the guise of godliness. Even sympathetic voices faltered. A philosopher who defended Elagabalus's theology later recanted, writing, "I spoke for a priest. I now see a butcher." The practice spread briefly. In the eastern provinces, some temple priests imitated the imperial choir, seeing it as a return to sacred purity. In Rome, however, it became the ultimate taboo. One senator, in a private letter, wrote, "The empire has no sons. It has only singers in skirts." And yet, behind the outrage, fascination brewed. Women of the court sent gifts to the choir. Some whispered of their beauty, others of their voices, still others of their wisdom. It was said one of them, named Chrysis, could see the future, that he or she once warned Elagabalus of a conspiracy days before it formed. The emperor believed them divine. He claimed their suffering purified the empire, that they were vessels of light, unchained from the tyranny of desire. He called them the children of the flame. And perhaps, in his mind, they were. But to Rome they were heresy incarnate. After his death, the choir was hunted. Most disappeared. Some were killed. A few escaped to the east where temple cults hid them. One was found years later, blind and mute, in Antioch. Another reappeared as a mystic in Alexandria. Their legacy became legend. Poets wrote verses about their voices. Painters imagined them as ghostly figures, walking through halls of marble and gold. One haunting sculpture survives in Naples, a faceless child in a diadem, mouth open in eternal song. Elagabalus had tried to make gods. Rome saw only victims. Elagabalus never stopped reinventing himself. For him, identity was not a question. It was a palette. Gender, costume, name, voice. Each became a brushstroke in the performance of godhood. One day he would appear as a bride, veiled in gold, hands stained with saffron. The next he would sit in the forum, dressed as a high priest, face solemn, bearing relics from a mesa. Then again he might ride through the streets, on a chariot pulled by naked women, declaring a festival of rebirth. No one knew what to expect, and that was the point. For Elagabalus, the role of emperor was too small. He wanted to be more than man, more than God. He wanted to be transformation itself. So he turned life into theatre. Every day, a new persona. Every night, a different self. He created shrines in his palace dedicated not to the Roman pantheon, but to fusion. In one chamber, statues of Apollo and Dionysus embraced. In another, Venus held hands with Mithras. He held ceremonies where masculine and feminine deities merged before the crowd. He claimed to have dreams where the gods spoke to him, not as a ruler, but as a vessel. They told him that boundaries were illusions, that the universe was flux, that truth lay in becoming. His court followed suit. Senators were encouraged to wear silk. Generals appeared with painted eyes. Men and women alike adorned themselves in garments from Persia, India, Egypt. One visitor described it as a palace of mirrors, nothing fixed, all reflections. But beyond the palace walls, fury brewed. The Roman people, steeped in tradition, saw the emperor's shifting image as weakness. Rumours claimed he no longer spoke as a man, that he demanded to be called empress in private, that he sought a surgeon to make his transformation complete. Some modern scholars have speculated this may mark one of the earliest documented expressions of gender transition in imperial history. But in Rome it was heresy. To the Senate it was insanity. The emperor's bride as goddess, as flame. They could tolerate cruelty, even indulgence. But not this, not the dissolution of identity itself, a rebellion of form, and Elagabalus knew it. He once said, according to Lampridius, what Rome hates most is the mirror that shows its masks. He saw himself not as aberration, but as prophecy. That one day, all boundaries would collapse, that gods would be reborn not in temples, but in selves. So he pushed further. He declared a festival called the Day of Union. All citizens were encouraged to dress as their opposites, men as women, patricians as slaves, priests as dancers. He rode through the city, smiling at the chaos he had made. It lasted one day. The next the Senate convened in outrage. A decree was prepared in secret. The praetorians began murmuring. His masks had become too vivid, too many. Rome had forgotten how to look at him, and when a city forgets your name, it begins to plan your death. The end came not with a bang, but with a whisper, the soft scrape of sandals in the night, the low rustle of armour behind a curtain. It was March, 222 CE. Elagabalus had taken refuge in the imperial quarters, his mother Julia Soaemius close at hand. The day had been restless. There were rumours that the Praetorian Guard was no longer loyal, that Alexander Severus, his cousin, had been paraded before the troops as the new hope. He dismissed them. He had heard rumours before, but this time they were true. The guards stormed the palace not with fanfare, but with purpose. The doors were not locked. The resistance was weak. The emperor, no longer the god, no longer the flame, was dragged screaming from his chambers, dressed in silk, eyes wide with betrayal. They killed his mother first, slaughtered before him. Then they turned to him. There was no ceremony, no last speech, just steel and fury. He begged. He wept. He cursed. He offered gold. He promised exile. They ignored him. He was only 18. His corpse was desecrated, dragged through the streets, spat on, mocked, his painted face marred with blood. Then, as with the worst of Rome's disgrace, his body was thrown into the Cloaca Maxima, the city's sewer. The sun god had drowned in filth, but the silence that followed was louder than his reign. Rome did not celebrate. It recoiled. The Senate erased his name from inscriptions, his images were destroyed, his laws annulled, his temple dismantled. Alexander Severus, only 14, was declared emperor. Julia Maesa, still standing, whispered her counsel, and quietly erased the past, but Elagabalus refused to vanish. Whispers remained. In the Subura, people still spoke of the boy in pearls. In the temples of Emesa, some still marked his birth with incense and red cloth. In the east, he was called not mad, but martyred. And in time, Rome would come to see that it had buried not a god, but a question it feared to ask. What is power when it defies shape? What is divinity when it wears a mirror? In the centuries to follow, emperors came and went. The empire rose and fell. Christianity replaced Jupiter. Marble turned to ruin. But Elagabalus remained. Beneath the surface, like a shadow on water. Artists returned to him. Writers unearthed him. Revolutionaries found in him the embodiment of excess, of revolt, of ecstasy unchecked. Psychologists called him narcissist or symbol or victim. Queer theorists debated his legacy. Some saw tragedy. Others triumph. But Rome never forgot. Because Rome could not forget what it tried hardest to deny. That once, for 4 short years, the empire knelt not to war or order, but to a boy who crowned himself God and demanded the world become dream. He ruled not by sword, but by spectacle. Not by fear, but by transformation. And for that, he paid with his life. The silence after was not peace. It was the breath before the memory returned. And in that breath, Elagabalus lives still. Forever becoming. Forever forbidden. Forever Rome's most dangerous reflection.